But there's something really interesting, I think, about puppet theatre that's very different to conventional theatre, in that I feel as though I think it's to do with empathy, really, because when we see something that we know isn't real, we kind of buy into that game in the same way we did when we were a little child with a piece of wood or a doll. Hello, Petra.
Good afternoon, Alison.
Good afternoon.
It's so lovely to meet you here on Zoom.
It's lovely to meet you too.
You are a puppeteer, and I've discovered you on Instagram, and it's so fascinating, the work that you're doing. Are you now in sort of your workshop? Because I see a lot of things going on in the background.
Yes, I'm in my workshop. I thought it would be interesting to be in my workshop because that's where it all happens. And I have puppets and masks from previous productions behind me. And, there's always something in progress as well.
But how long have you been doing this?
Well, quite a long time.
Okay.
I haven't put a number on it. Probably about 25 years, I think. Yeah, around 25 years. I started really when I was living in the United States, and I got involved with a puppet and mask theatre called In the Heart of the Beast Puppet and Mask Theatre in Minneapolis. And they were just really wonderful and welcoming, and I got so excited about their way of making art that was very socially engaged and beautiful and inspiring. And so I started there, and I've just carried on, and some things are still very influenced by their work, and other things, things progress and change, and you develop as an artist. So, yeah.
But were you, as a child, interested in puppets? What drew you to this art form?
Wow. Was I interested in puppets? Not particularly, but I definitely remember having sort of like dreams about having little fairies that came to live in my house. And, I guess like a lot of children, just that fascination with the miniature and the otherworldly, and just an idea that there could be sort of a secret other life that only you knew about.
Yeah.
So it definitely hadn't progressed into puppetry, but it was, about imagination and fantasy and small worlds. Yeah. So
it's so great to hear that, because when I was a child, I always believed in the little, the little mushrooms that grew on the grass. I always believed that there were fairies living in there. Well, and I got so upset when the children would kick the little mushrooms on the grass because I was thinking they're destroying the houses of the fairies.
Yeah. Well, they probably were.
But Alison, now this is an art form, but this in many ways, really, because it's sculpting, and it's also it's very visual. I don't know. It's like storytelling. There's so many aspects of this art form that's so interesting. So, did you have sort of the sculpting part of it now? Did you have training to be able to do that?
I didn't train at an art school or university. I actually started down a different route, and I was originally studying literature, English and German literature, and specifically medieval literature. That's where I thought I was going. But when I was at school, I so loved making art, and I loved working with my hands. And I just remember a moment when I was about 22 and I was doing a master's, thinking, I don't want this world. I need to make things. And so I really just got involved at every opportunity I could in helping somebody who I knew who was a maker. And I had really been very lucky at school when I was a teenager that we had a fantastic ceramics tutor, and I really had made a lot of sculpture then. And so it was, that period of university, I didn't make things, and then I came back to it. And still, it's my favorite part of the process, is the sculpting in the clay and thinking about who a character is and trying to imagine their life through the sculpture. So when I'm creating a mask or a puppet head, that's really when I start to think about who this person is.
So you see the character in your mind before you start working, or does it evolve while you are working?
Well, it really depends on the production. Sometimes I'm a freelance puppet maker as well as making my own work. So when I'm making things for other people, they quite often will have an idea already of who this character is. There may be a script, there may be, the director may have a pre-existing idea. So then I'm really trying to just channel into their vision. But when I'm making my own work and I start with writing, sort of still fairly early on in that, trying to imagine who the characters are comes so much from working in the clay and doing the sculpture. And then there's whole nother level, which is when you give that puppet or mask to a performer and they find its other life, its movement life. That's something completely different again. So it's definitely layers. It's not as straightforward as if it's just a piece of sculpture that that I see the whole picture. It's actually more of a collaborative process, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I can imagine. It almost draw lines for me now to the animators that I talk to. It's also this character development, and it's also this collaboration, because it's everybody's input in this, in this art form.
Yes, I think it's very similar to animation in that way. There are the people who are the model makers, the sculptors, and then there are the people that are the animators and the writers. And once production gets bigger, the more divided each role becomes. But the lovely thing about creating a piece of work from the beginning is to be involved in all of those processes. So to be involved in the writing and the sculpture and the direction. So, working out which parts of a performer's movement world you need to keep in the story and which parts, So that's really interesting.
But we associate puppets with children's theatre, but yet it is not necessarily. It's more, you can really do amazing productions with it, and it's not necessarily children-based, but also adult-based.
Absolutely. And there's a really interesting thing. I've made a lot of work for children, and I've made a lot of work for adults, and both are really rich in different ways. But there's something really interesting, I think, about puppet theatre that's very different to conventional theatre, in that I feel as though I think it's to do with empathy, really, because when we see something that we know isn't real, we kind of buy into that game in the same way we did when we were a little child with a piece of wood or a doll. And although as an adult we may be watching a piece of theatre that is more challenging than would be suitable for a child, I think we still enter into that with that same openness that a child has when they approach a piece of theatre, and that want to play along with the rules of that game that are being set up, that want to care about what's happening and the characters. It's really interesting. It kind of opens a little door in the observer, in the audience, for adding our own imagination into a piece in a way that conventional theatre does less, I think, because it's telling us so much about what to think.
Yeah. But is this an art form that is growing, or is it something that needs to be more highlighted? You would say, is it something that's becoming popular, or because you don't see as much. It's not a very well-known also industry behind the scenes. If I just look, for example, finding puppeteers, because I've been looking for puppeteers to talk to, and you're not everywhere.
Okay. I guess I see a lot of puppeteers because maybe that's the little
Oh,
world
you are, yeah.
But I would say actually there's a little bit of a revival at the moment
Really?
in puppetry in theatre. I think, you know what, I would say obviously it's a really ancient art form. There's always been puppet theatre, and then there are lots of different threads and kind of families of puppet theatre, I suppose. But I would say in the last 10 years, maybe, I think I've seen more puppetry involved in other theatre. So not necessarily a complete puppet theatre, although that does exist. But I think more and more theatre directors, certainly in this country, are thinking, oh, how can we integrate other forms into the work? And so, yeah, I think there's a kind of a revival. A lot of people would probably say it was around that time that Warhorse came onto the stage.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of people saw that piece who wouldn't normally think of puppets as something they would want to see, and went, oh, actually, do you know what? Puppetry is really exciting.
Yeah.
And certainly in this country, it's kind of led to a lot of productions that have animals or in them, which can be really fantastic too. But there's another way of using puppets in conventional theatre, which is more exciting to me, which is kind of like exploring the dream world, kind of the area in between reality and in between realities, so that the more imaginative, the more unheimlich, that kind of the strangeness is our subconscious world, I think. That's
but you're talking about Warhorse now, and I mean that's a sort of a combination of two art forms. But I also see that you have used your puppets in opera as well.
That's right. Yes, and I recently worked with. I worked on a couple of operas in the last couple of years, both very small scale. But yes, one was a contemporary opera about care, it was all connected with the pandemic and how important caregivers are to people. And so for that, I created a puppet of an older woman who was at the end of her life, and the carer that was looking after her. And the carer was the singer, and the puppet at that point died. And the reason that we used a puppet for that role is that we wanted her to literally disappear into the ether. So as her kind of soul spirit left her body, the puppet separated into parts. So you can do things, you can create metaphors that you can't with an actor. So sometimes a puppet is exactly what you need for that moment. And then the other opera I worked on recently was with a conservatoire here in West Yorkshire in Leeds. And they were all young opera singers. And we created a piece called The Light Princess, which was kind of also a new opera, but it was sort of really for them to learn the repertoire. And it was about a princess who is cursed, a little bit like Sleeping Beauty, but instead of sleeping, she floats until she can find her gravity. So that was a really fun thing to work on, training the young singers to also be puppeteers.
Amazing. And how do they work with these puppets? Is it for them easy because they're used to working with people, with other singers? Yeah.
I think some people, you can really see some people have total instinct for that, and other people not. I would say sometimes actors and singers their need or their training and their instinct is to put their own energy forward. And there's a thing that's slightly different about working with a puppet, which is about supporting the energy of something else and being able to channel your energy and your voice and your focus through something that's not you. So that's your vehicle to the audience. And that can be a little tricky, I think, for some people. Actually, dancers are great at it. They're used to making shapes with their bodies. But it's just about channeling what we all were able to do when we were a child, which is play and believe in something else, that it has a life as well.
But your puppets have moving parts. Is this something that you specifically specialize in? Because I saw there you were working on things, and then it's specific that it has working parts.
Yes, I would say I've made many different types of puppets, and it really depends on the piece that it's being made for. But when you know what the needs of a production are, you might know that something needs to be able, you might make a bird and it needs to be able to flap its wings, it needs to be able to look around, it needs, there might be certain actions that are important, and so then you do need to embed those mechanisms into the sculpture. But also sometimes the most beautiful puppets, and I would say in a theatre environment where you can really focus on something, the most beautiful puppets are actually incredibly simple. And it's just about that interplay between the sculpture and the movement of the puppeteer and the focus and the imagination of the audience. And to me, sometimes that can be the most eloquent, the most elegant puppet that's not really super techy, but just is allowed to have its time and its space. But the other part of it, the moving parts, is always for me a learning process. It's always a challenge. It's always like, oh no, I need to make this do this, and it's really important. I can't fake it. It needs to be able to, have legs that walk properly or whatever. And
then it's Alison. Then it's Alison, the engineer.
Exactly. Then you have to drag out that engineering part. That's not my natural comfort zone, but you have to learn things. Yeah. And I learn from other puppeteers. We're a really wonderful sharing community, I would say. I learn from other puppeteers who are more geeky than me. I can make that work. And so learn things and adapt them and make them your own. I'm actually just going to next week be teaching a course in Newcastle at the Puppet Festival there in puppet making. So we'll be making a tabletop puppet. And so part of that is the sculpting, but then there's a part of it is teaching certain kind of jointing, so mechanisms. So that'll be really interesting to show people how to make those things.
Yeah. So in these workshops that you do, these are all people working as puppeteers, or they're just people interested? So if somebody's just interested in doing something in that, for themselves, is that also the people that come to your workshops?
Yeah, I actually don't know the whole, I don't know everybody who's coming to do this workshop, so it's fantastic to meet them wherever they are. But it's certainly open to people who are not existing puppeteers, or people who are, but just want to have a week experimenting and learning somebody else's method, because we can all learn from each other. I take workshops with other puppeteers sometimes because everybody brings something different to the art form that's inspiring. And just to be in other people's presence and play with materials and create something new is exciting. So I know that I have some people who have already made some puppets, and I know that there are some younger artists who certainly earlier on in their journey that are just really soaking up all the information they can so that they can make too.
That's amazing. But now, do you have a puppet there that you can show us?
I do. Yes, I can show you. Well, I have, this is a goldfinch puppet. This is kind of a techie puppet, I suppose, and that it has a head. So, and he has wings that can flap.
Amazing.
He's a carved puppet. It's a carved puppet that's actually a part of a touring piece that I've made, which is a cycle-powered carousel. And it has all hand-carved wooden animals on it. Mm-hmm. And I worked with a metal a kinetic artist who made the mechanism for it. And so that tours around, and it has lots of different wildlife animals. And this is one of the puppets that goes with it. So amazing. This little guy.
So it's made from wood. Is it carved wood?
It's carved from lime wood, linden, which is I use a lot because it's a native wood to here. Okay. But it has a really lovely straight grain. It's not too difficult to carve. And that's the wood that I'll be using for the course next week. Yeah.
And you carve, do you do the carving?
I do the carving. So yeah.
Amazing.
The material, I think the materials that I prefer to use are either wood, if it's fairly small and want some detail, or I also really love to use clay and papier-mâché if it's something that's a little bigger. So this is a mask. It's actually an unpainted mask that I made a few years ago. But so I would start with a big lump of clay and then cover it in papier-mâché, and then it may be used unpainted in a performance, or I might, this one was one that was made for an outdoor performance. This is a high head mask, so it sits on top of somebody's head.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's got a very particular cross-hatched painting style because I wanted it to look a little bit like an engraving.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because of the production.
Beautiful. Oh, wow.
So this is a little. So yes, this is another head for a puppet that is unfinished. I started it, but this is a wooden one. Okay.
But it looks so real. I mean, lifelike, isn't it? It's you look like you're a sculptor. It's beautiful.
Yes, that's definitely the part of the process that I love the most is the sculpting part. But then I say that, but I also love the performance part. I'm not a natural performer myself. I really much prefer to give the puppet to somebody else who I know will bring life to it and be that outside eye, kind of the making the picture from the outside.
But if you use somebody now, so if somebody else takes the puppet, do you get sometimes where you're a bit disappointed in how they would make the character come alive, or are you always happy with the way people do that?
No, I think it's always a conversation. I think people bring something to it, and then that might spark an idea, and you say, actually, do you know what? If you just at that moment, if you just lift the head, that will allow me to, understand that character's thoughts, or just if you could do that, but if you just slow it down to half that speed, that would be beautiful. So it's always a conversation. So a puppeteer, as long as they understand the basics of giving focus to the puppet and, imagining its weight and imagining its inner life, as long as they bring those things to the table, they always know that it's important that there's somebody on the outside who can see what's happening, that they can't see themselves. And so you you develop that performance together.
This almost makes me think about composers, because I speak to composers as well, and I've always asked this question, if the musicians who play the music, if they understand what the composer wanted, and this is the same, you know, that you say, and they also talk about this communication, this understanding, you know, from the musician's side, but then also from the composer being very happy about the way it's being interpreted. So it's the same thing with puppeteering then as well.
Yeah, I think it's probably the same with so many art forms that involve an outside eye, you know, that director eye, that there's kind of a magic that comes between those two roles, between the performer who has their instincts and they have an openness to play and explore and bring their ideas to the table, but then also that acknowledgement that the person on the outside who's trying to guide the story or guide the image can see things that the performer doesn't see. And, you know, that's where the interesting conversations start.
Yeah. Now, Alison, what are the wishes for you now still for the future?
Oh, wishes. Well, you always want to make the thing that's really beautiful.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Quite often when I look at the things that I've made before, I kind of think, well, it was fine for that role. But as an object, I'm not, you know, there are things I would change about it. Absolutely. So there's always that constant striving to make something more and more and more satisfying to yourself, to explore those things more, and just explore more stories. You know, that's exciting. I'm currently talking to some performers in Iraq about some stories that they want to tell. And that at the moment, that's very exciting to me to think about, how does the way that I work meet another culture, another set of traditions, another set of people, and what's that conversation like? So
that's amazing.
All interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking now in South Africa, there's the Khoi tribe. And I've just recently seen that they also make these animals and also the puppets and telling stories, their cultural stories. So it's wonderful. I didn't think about it now. It's just when you talked about now about these stories, it's a wonderful way to, you know, to bring these stories alive again.
And South Africa has such an amazing, rich tradition, both of traditional puppetry, as you say, that's been there for generations and generations. And then there are other really exciting puppeteers who have sort of developed that art within our lifetime, you know. So Handspring, obviously, are really well known around the world, but also there are other fantastic puppeteers making contemporary work that's playing with those traditional African art forms and with European influence and putting those things together and making something
amazing. Yeah. Wow, this is so interesting. Well, Alison, this was so lovely talking to you. First of all, I want to say I'm so happy that you also believe that there lived fairies in the mushrooms in my garden.
Absolutely. They still live there, I'm sure.
And you've just opened up such a great world for me, and it's just absolutely wonderful what you're doing, and I hope that all your wishes come true and that you make the most beautiful puppets still.
It was really lovely talking to you, Petra. Thanks so much for inviting me for this conversation. And really, really lovely to...
It's a great pleasure. I so want to just highlight all these different forms of art, and I'm always so amazed and you know, the things and all the collaborations people do. I just draw lines and connect. It's just amazing how all these art forms just come together.
It's wonderful.
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 Alison, wishing you a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.